Welcome back to the Mindset of Podcasting. And this week, we're going to be talking about how to become a guest on podcasts, on other people's podcasts. Because one of the best way to grow your podcast is to be on other people's podcasts. And that is because people are already listening to podcasts. Their listeners are already listening. They're already in their podcast app. So it's so easy for them to just open their app that they're already in and type in your podcast and download a few episodes and listen to them. So you already have those listeners there. They're right there on their platform. So we just need to get them to your podcast. And that's a great way to do it is to get in front of other people's listeners. And that's why you want to go on a podcast to be seen as the expert and get your name out there. So you're probably like, well, how do I do that? Like, where do I find these podcasts and how do I actually approach them to be a guest? Well, that is what today's episode is all about. So I have 3 tips on how we can do this. So my first tip is you want to be very specific about what you talk about. You want to be seen as the expert in a specific field. So, for example, if I went on a podcast, I am going to be talking about how to start and grow your podcast as a female entrepreneur. That is my very specific thing that I do. I'm not going on there just saying, well, I help everybody start podcasts, every single person. I want to be able to speak to people's specific listeners. So I know that I'm going to be going on podcasts that have mostly female audiences. Those are the podcasts that I'm going to want to look for. So you want to be very specific about what your topic is that you speak about and what you want to be seen as an expert in, which is usually what your coaching, your product, your service is based in. So also be very specific about who you serve too, because you don't want to go on a podcast. Like I don't want to go on a podcast where 99% of the listeners are men when I mostly focus on female entrepreneurs. Like that's not going to benefit me or their listeners or that host podcast at all. So we need to be very specific about what we talk about and who we are serving. So I would write that down first, be very clear about that. Number 2 is I would customize your pitches. So in the next tip, I'm going to tell you where to find podcasts to be on. But in this tip, when you find those podcasts that you want to be on, you are going to go listen to a few episodes. You're not just going to willy nilly send them an email. You are actually going to listen to a few episodes so that you can personalize the email pitch that you are sending. You're going to tell them what you liked about the episode, how it helped you, what value you got out of it. That's what they want to hear, that you actually took the time out to actually listen to an episode of their podcast. So take the time to listen to it and then customize your pitch. Say, hey, this is what I like about your podcast. This is how I think what I talk about will benefit your listeners. We never, ever want to make an email pitch about ourselves. We don't want to go in with, well, I have this many followers and blah, blah, blah. Like, that's great. But what are you going to give my listeners? How are my listeners going to benefit from what you have to say? I don't care how many followers you have. Like, we want our podcast to give value, and that is what's most important. So, in your pitch, you're going to say, this is the value that I will give your listeners. This is what I can help them with. And this is why I think I will be a good fit for your podcast. Because if we're sending a generic email pitch to the same podcasters over and over again, they're going to be able to tell. I can tell when I get a generic email pitch. Like, it has nothing personal about me. I just hate them. And you can feel it too. It's not the same energy. So it's different energy when you know that that person has actually invested time in you and your podcast already and in learning about your listeners and learning about your business and how they can actually help them. And I would also always tell them, like, hey, as a guest on your podcast, I would love to help you promote it. I'd be willing to promote it with any graphics you have or any way that you wish for me to promote it. Because that's also a thing. They want to get in front of your audience too. As a guest, they want people to come to their podcast and listen to you. And then yeah, and then oh my gosh. And then your audience will find them too. So it's kind of a back and forth. Like we're going to share audiences basically. That's also why I like podcast swaps. So podcast swaps are where the hosts are guests on each other's podcast. So one will be a guest on your podcast and then you'll be a guest on somebody else's podcast. And I think podcast swaps are great because it gets both set of listeners in front of each other. So, or, oh my gosh, I said that wrong. And I think podcast swaps are great because it will get you and the other host in front of each other's audiences, which is wonderful. So if you can do a swap, always mention that you're open to a podcast swap, but only if they'll be a good fit for your podcast too. So make sure that they're a good fit for your podcast too. And now, the most important thing that everybody asks about: where can I find these podcasts that are looking for guests? Do I just look them up in my podcast app? And then when I look them up in my podcast app, how do I find their email address? Where do I get all this information from? Like, how do I find these people? So, there are a few different sites that I use that think are amazing sites and that you should definitely use. Matchmaker.fm. This is a this is a completely free site. They do have a paid version. I use the free site and I have found so many guests for my podcast. I have found so many podcasts to be on. You seriously just type in a keyword and it will bring up all the podcasts with that keyword. And then right there on Matchmaker, you can message that person and reach out with your email pitch. So, and you can also put your podcast on there and people can reach out to you if you're looking for guests and ask if they can be a guest on your podcast, which people have done for me too. So that is an amazing site. I love that. There's also the Podcast Collective Facebook group, free Facebook group to join. And there's always people in there looking for guests or looking to be on podcasts. So that is a great community to join. There are lots of posts in there about that. You can post if you're looking for a guest. Be prepared to get a lot of responses and to weed through them and make sure that people are a good fit just to prepare you. If you say you're looking for a guest in that group, that is what that group is for. So you will get a little bombarded. Or if you say you're looking to be a guest on a podcast, you will maybe get a little bombarded. So just be prepared for that and to weed through the people who might not be a good fit. Or another thing that you can do is there is a podcast that you love and that you think that you will be an amazing guest on. Find them on Instagram. Start building a relationship with them. You know, building a relationship with a host is a great idea and it will help them get to know you better and they can see that you'll be a good fit so that when you do ask them to be a guest on their podcast, it's not like out of the blue totally. I am all for building relationships, building connections with people. We all like to make new friends. So find a podcast host that you really like and start building a relationship. Comment on their posts, comment on their stories, just build that relationship. So it's not completely out of the blue when you do say, hey, are you looking for guests to be on your podcast? Or who knows, maybe even they'll reach out to you and say, hey, I'm looking for guests. So those are a few things that you can do to become a guest on a podcast, which I think is an amazing idea. I'm actually going to be a guest on a podcast today. So a few tips so that you're not so nervous. It can be nerve-wracking to be a guest on a podcast. Okay. I know I said this in the last episode. I've said that a gazillion times, but in case this is your first time listening, my first podcast interview was a disaster, so much so that they ended up not even airing it. Like they did not air it at all. It was horrible. I was so nervous. I had brain farts. It was really bad. And that's because I did not prepare before time. And I'm going to tell you right now, you need to prepare. So if you feel that you need questions or you need kind of a guideline of what the topics will be about, don't be afraid to ask. Say, hey, if you don't have questions, that's fine. But if you could just like let me know a little bit about what topics you'll be asking about, that would be great. It doesn't hurt to ask that. I've had no problem providing some of my guest questions when they've asked me for those. So don't be hesitant to reach out and ask for questions, ask for topics that they want to talk about so you can prepare just a little bit, maybe have a little bit of notes in front of you so that you know in case you have that brain fart that you kind of know what you're talking about. Because that brain fart will happen. Yes. But the more you do it, the better you will get. So I started doing that in the beginning. I had them send me questions so that it would get a little bit easier. And now, like the one today, I don't have any questions. I didn't ask for them. It's just going to kind of be more of a flow thing. And I know her. We've built a relationship, me and this podcast host. So I think it's going to be so much easier to talk to her because we already have that relationship. So let me know if you need some help being a guest on podcast. reach out to me. You can DM me on Instagram at Jillian Grover Podcast Solutions. I'm also on TikTok at the Podcast Solution. I love to connect with you and answer any questions that you have, and I will talk to you next week.